Even Federer had to pull up to watch Eala. That's how phenomenal she has been over this last week and a bit. But Ayala's run is done. She is out of Wimbledon. She showed fight, she showed grit, she showed determination. But today was just the beginning of something special. Big shout out to Jasmine Paolini, who's into another quarterfinal at Wimbledon. She beat Eala in 3 unbelievable sets of tennis with momentum going back and forth, and she just edged it.
2 million people watched the highlights of one single match on Wimbledon's YouTube channel. More than double the combined audience for matches involving Novak Djokovic and Serena Williams, combined. And the player at the center of all that attention hadn't even won the tournament. Stay with me. She walked off the most famous tennis court on earth, raised her hands into the shape of a heart toward a stand full of strangers who somehow felt like family, and said something so simple it almost got lost in the roar around her. Never say die. Play every point like your life depends on it. Rewind 3 years. A girl training after school on a public court back home, ruffled socks, light-up shoes, chubby cheeks, her grandfather standing at the fence watching every rally like it mattered more than anything else in the world that day. That same girl just made center court shake. London in July. 31 degrees. The kind of heat that usually thins a Wimbledon crowd out by mid-afternoon, sends people looking for shade under the old oak trees near Court 1, has security fanning themselves in the tunnels. Not this year. Not around this court. Flags that had rarely, if ever, been seen in these stands before, hundreds of them. Then thousands turned SW19 into something that looked less like the most traditional tournament in tennis, and more like a homecoming nobody had scheduled. Practice courts that normally host a scattering of tourists and a few autograph hunters were suddenly standing room only. 3 and 4 rows deep, hours before a single ball was struck. Volunteers stopped being surprised by it. Security staff started planning for it. Every single time one name went up on the order of play board, the crowd around that court tripled within minutes. Something was building here that had nothing to do with seating, and everything to do with belief. Walk the grounds during her matches and you'd notice it in the smaller details, the ones that don't make the highlight reels. The way ushers started recognizing faces in the queue because the same families kept showing up outside the same court. 4 days in a row, just to watch a 40-minute practice session. The way one broadcaster, mid-broadcast, simply admitted on air that she had goosebumps she couldn't fully explain to viewers back home. The way strangers from completely different countries started quietly asking each other who this girl even was, and why everyone around them already seemed to know her by heart. Nobody had to explain the moment to the people living inside it. They recognized it the second it started happening. She wasn't the favorite. She wasn't even projected to make the second week. Alexandra Eala, 21 years old, ranked 32 in the world, a graduate of the Rafael Nadal Academy, a place built to manufacture champions, though it never guarantees you become one. A year earlier, she'd already given the sport a preview of what was coming, beating a top 10 player at the Miami Open in a run that carried her to her first Masters 1000 semi-final, then becoming the first Filipina to win a Grand Slam main draw match. Then a nod on the Forbes 30 under 30 list for a career that was barely finished introducing itself. Not raw power, not a serve built to end points in one shot. Her game was built on something slower to notice and far harder to coach: anticipation, footwork, the simple refusal to let a rally die before it absolutely had to. She chased down balls that players with twice her experience would have waved goodbye to. And then, on a Saturday that will be replayed for years, she met the reigning Wimbledon champion, the very woman who had handed her her academy diploma 3 years earlier, and beat her 7-6, 6-2, to become the first Filipino player in the Open era to reach the 4th round of a Grand Slam. That was the peak. That was the moment an entire draw quietly reshaped itself around one name that, a week earlier, casual fans couldn't have spelled. Then came the serve that wouldn't cooperate. It's easy, in hindsight, to talk about a defeat as though it were written from the start. It wasn't. This was a genuine contest between two players who had both fought their way back into form that season, on a surface that punishes hesitation more than any other in the sport. Round of 16 against Jasmine Paolini, a two-time Grand Slam finalist who had spent the season fighting her own injuries and doubts. Eala's first delivery, some of it barely clearing 80 miles an hour, found the box less than half the time it needed to. At 4-1 down in the opening set, one first serve clipped the net cord and died there. The next one sailed long. This wasn't nerves cracking open in front of the world. It wasn't a collapse anyone could point to and call soft. It was one specific, mechanical problem, showing up on the single day it could least afford to, against an opponent sharp enough to make her pay for every one of those misses. She leveled the match anyway, forcing a third set the hard way, breaking back after squandering earlier chances. She lost that final set 6-3. 6-4, 4-6, 6-3. The scoreboard read final. Her tournament was over. No excuses afterward. Just an honest, quiet sentence delivered in a press room that had gone unusually still. Everyone has days where they don't play their best tennis, and she doesn't expect to play her best every single day of her life. Compare that to how she talked after beating the defending champion just 2 days earlier, when the tears hadn't even dried yet. She wasn't satisfied then either. She said locking back in, refocusing the moment a celebration ends, was a skill just like any other something you build on purpose. Not something that simply arrives with talent. That single detail says more about how far she can still go than any trophy would have. Here's the strange part. The scoreline said Paolini won. The story said something else entirely. Cameras caught the crowd rising to their feet as Eala left the court, still shaping that heart with her hands. Tears she wasn't trying to hide. Broadcasters spent more airtime dissecting the girl who had lost than celebrating the woman who had advanced. Filipino networks led their coverage with her name, not the result. Somehow, the earlier she went out of the tournament, the louder the room around her seemed to get. That is the paradox nobody predicted going in. A first-week upset over a 6-time major champion makes for a good headline. A gutting, honest defeat 2 rounds later, handled with that much composure, turned her into something a headline can't fully contain. Because none of this was ever really about one match, or even one tournament. It was about who was watching, and why they couldn't look away. Public viewing parties packed sports bars and living rooms across the Philippines before sunrise. Families gathered around a single television the way an older generation once did for a different sport entirely. Built around a different national name, Manny Pacquiao. The only real precedent this country has had for this kind of collective, unbroken attention on one athlete. Commentators who have covered this sport for decades said, on air, without hesitation, that they had never seen a following quite like it bigger, some admitted on the record, than several of the actual number ones in the game right now. This is the part of the story that travels past the baseline and the scoreboard entirely. It isn't really about tennis anymore. It's about a country that had never had someone to point to on a stage this size, finally having one, and refusing to let her carry that weight by herself. She said it herself plainly, without a hint of rehearsed polish. Sitting in front of a room full of reporters who expected something more guarded, she doesn't want anyone watching to try becoming the next her. She wants them to become the first version of themselves. That sentence is doing more work, for more people, than most sponsorship campaigns ever managed to do. And it isn't only happening in Manila or in London. It's happening in smaller cities across Southeast Asia, in countries that have never produced a Grand Slam contender of their own, where young players and their parents are watching a 21-year-old prove that the distance between a public court and center court might be shorter than anyone previously believed. That's the feeling underneath all of this, the one that has nothing to do with nationality specifically, and everything to do with recognition, the simple, universal relief of watching someone who looks like you, who started where you started, do something you'd quietly convinced yourself wasn't possible from where you're standing. Every single win added another name to a list of kids who now believe tennis has room for them too. That kind of ripple doesn't show up in a ranking chart, but it's the part of this story that will outlast whatever happens in the next 12 months. Because this is not close to finished, and pretending otherwise would be the real disservice to what she's built so far. She is 21 years old, ranked outside the top 30, and has already beaten a defending Wimbledon champion and multiple top 10 players before turning 22. The next marker is obvious and specific, not vague optimism, a maiden Grand Slam quarterfinal, plausibly as soon as the US Open later this year, on the very court where she first broke through into a major main draw. After that comes a real sustained push toward the top 20, the range where seeding stops being a lottery ticket and starts becoming a weapon in her own hands. And somewhere not far past that horizon sits an Olympic appearance, carrying a flag that has waited a long time for a tennis story built to fill it. None of that is promised. All of it is now genuinely plausible, in a way it simply was not 12 months ago, and that gap between plausible and inevitable is exactly where the most interesting careers get written. Every one of those next steps will be measured, fairly, against the same standard she just set for herself in London, not by whether she wins every time she steps out, but by whether she keeps forcing the world's best players to take her seriously from the very first point. Wimbledon crowned a champion this year, and give it 2 weeks, most casual fans won't remember who actually lifted that trophy. They will remember the 21-year-old who didn't. They will remember 1.2 million people choosing to rewatch a loss highlight over the wins of legends. Because for once, on that one afternoon in London, the final score genuinely wasn't the point. So here's a question worth sitting with, and we want to hear your honest answer, not just the easy one. Can Alexandra Eala actually go all the way and win a Grand Slam one day, not just reach the second week again, but stand there holding the trophy? Tell us exactly where you land in the comments below, and why. Whatever your answer, one thing is already true and won't be argued away by whoever wins the next major. The tournament remembers its champions by name every single year, but it only remembers a handful of runs by feeling. This was one of them. Not because of a trophy that never came, but because of a crowd that refused to let a loss feel like an ending. Say it plainly, one way or the other, and let's see who was right when the moment actually arrives. In a few years, when everyone knows this name you'll want a record of when you knew first.